Hi, welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast. I'm Robert Bryce. On this podcast, we talk about energy, power, innovation, and politics. And we're going to talk a lot about politics and energy and power with my guest, Annie Hawkins. She is the Executive Director of the Responsible Offshore Development Alliance. Annie, welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast.
Thank you, and thanks so much for having me.
You bet. Now, I didn't warn you, which maybe is unfair, but I have guests introduce themselves. I could talk about you and what you've done, but I find it more interesting to have guests introduce themselves. So imagine that you've just arrived somewhere, you don't know anyone, you have about 30 or 45 seconds to explain that. Go.
Sure thing. So I'm the Executive Director of the Responsible Offshore Development Alliance, which is a national commercial fishing industry trade association. We've got about 200 members across the country, and our members represent all various businesses that operate in the seafood sector, from harvesting to processing of U.S. fresh sustainable seafood.
And so tell me, if you don't mind, then that's a good summary, because I made note of that. So why now? Why does this, I know that there have been I've spoken with Bonnie Brady of the Long Island Commercial Fishing Association. I've talked to other people, Megan Lapp, who's also in the fishing business. Why did RODA start, and why does it matter now?
Yeah, so RODA started in 2018. We started actually on the East Coast in southern New England in the Mid-Atlantic, and we've grown to be, to my knowledge, the largest membership association for commercial seafood harvesting and processing in the U.S. We started really with the goal of working on offshore wind energy development. There are other commercial fishing associations. There always have been. We don't really have one large U.S. association like they have in a lot of countries, and that's because our fleets are so diverse, and our fisheries and our regions are so diverse, and so there's a lot of issues that are really difficult to kind of create a consensus or unified position on when it comes to fisheries. On offshore wind, people are pretty unified in their messaging and in their concerns about it. And so we were able to grow really, really quickly. Like I said, starting on the East Coast, where we had offshore wind energy projects proposed off of New England, the Mid-Atlantic, and then growing into other regions, right, as they're being proposed there.
Sure.
And so I'm sure. Yeah,
so if I can interrupt, because I've been to Montauk, I went out, I visited with Bonnie Brady and her husband, Dave, yes, I'm not mistaking Dave's last name. What's the conflict here? Why are so many commercial fishing operations and fishermen, fisherwomen opposed to this expansion? Because there is a very large expansion of offshore wind that's being planned. And so are these direct in conflict with commercial fishing? And if so, how?
Yeah, they are directly in conflict. And so, it's funny, across the country, there's a whole range, as you would expect, of fishermen, from people that are just outright opposed to offshore wind energy, to ones that say, well, renewable energy is really important. And obviously everybody's concerned about climate change, especially these guys and women who are out on the water every day, seeing the environmental changes. But what is really consistent is a serious concern about the environmental impacts of offshore wind that are often overlooked in the sort of race to address climate change. There's been very little talk about just sort of how large these projects are and the effects that they have to biodiversity and habitats and fisheries and protected resources, as well as the process overall, right? So there's these sort of science questions, and then there's questions about when you're embarking on a new large-scale energy source and a large-scale habitat conversion and industrialization of the ocean. Who needs to have a seat at that table, and how you decide how to do that, and when and where and how fast. To a person, folks in the fishing industry really have not been included in those conversations. We really have not been doing a good job of balancing looking at new energy sources and the need for trade-offs so that we can still have this seafood supply and have food security and this renewable protein that we're supplying.
So you're saying that the government officials, the policymakers, is it fair to say they've ignored the interests of the fishing community? Is that a fair statement?
I think that's a fair statement. Yes, unfortunately it is. There are a lot of meetings about this. There are a lot of what a regulator would call opportunities for engagement, but it's not meaningful engagement. It's not authentic. It's not including fishermen and folks with that really firsthand knowledge of the ecosystems as trusted planners and trusted partners in this type of development.
So I looked at your bio. You're a lawyer. You have a master's in marine affairs. You have a BA in conservation biology. So your background suggests you're very familiar with these conflicts. But it seems to me that, I mean, the scale of what's being talked about here. I think the Biden administration, well, here are the numbers. Recently announced goal for 30,000 megawatts of offshore wind. If all of that is built, I mean, how much ocean territory might that cover? I don't know if you have that number at hand. And which of the commercial fishing operations and which species of fish that are targeted by fishermen, which ones are the most at risk?
So it's the most at risk look different in the early projects versus the projects that we have a little bit further down the pipeline. I don't have the number offhand of what that would be, but I do know, right now, just for the areas that are already leased off of southern New England alone, there's one area where it's 1,400 square miles in one cluster. And now we've got new lease areas in New York Bight that are approaching that big again. So these are huge, huge, huge areas.
So we're talking about thousands of miles of fisheries that could become off limits because of the danger to navigation. I mean, that was one of the things when I was in Montauk, now I guess 4 years ago, that of the fishermen that I talked to, that was one thing that they consistently cited was a hazard to navigation. That was before they started talking about, forgive me here. That was before they started talking about the issues of tangled nets or of structures on the bottom of the ocean, et cetera, that they were really concerned about the navigation issues. But so, I mean, just in what you just said, 3,000 square miles or more, that's a huge area.
Yeah, it's huge. And that's exactly right. I mean, there's concerns about navigation. There's concerns about economics, of course, to fishing communities and to fisheries production, as well as those environmental concerns and others. I mean, and so on, right? You were talking about these environmental justice communities, right, as we call them, coastal communities with minority populations, or where a big part of the jobs are housed in the seafood sector, right, and how long they've supported those communities. There's just a lot of things wrapped up in here. And there really seems to be a perspective that, because this is renewable energy and because we need to address climate change, that this is a win-win for the environment. It's good. We'll put in all these offshore turbines, and that only has a net positive effect. And that's just not the case. And so, we're not, of course, taking a position on energy production and that sort of stuff, but just saying that in every other industry that we, existing industries, new industries, we do our due diligence, right? And we analyze the environmental effects and we plan accordingly to minimize what those are. With offshore wind, we're not talking about taking some toothpicks and putting them, sticking them in the ocean and it's just, pretty extreme. These are large industrial projects and they will have a lot of impacts. And we just want a much better understanding of what those are so that we are planning accordingly.
You use the phrase industrialization of the oceans, which was a line that I remember Jesse Ausubel, who's at Rockefeller University, used in terms of this. And it seems remarkable given that the years of discussions about protecting the marine environment, and particularly marine mammals, that now there's this rush to add a whole lot more structures. In fact, by my calculations, you would need far more offshore wind platforms off the East Coast than exist oil and gas platforms in the Gulf of Mexico. And we're talking about thousands of structures potentially. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And unlike oil and gas, where you have the platform and some infrastructure associated with that, but with the offshore wind turbines, there's inter-array cables between all of them. There's substations, there's cooling stations. There's just a lot of stuff that goes with that, right? And it does create a much bigger environmental footprint in terms of the actual physical footprint, right? As well as that bigger sort of navigational concern. And so we really are looking at something quite different than oil and gas, although people like to compare it a lot. With oil and gas, the way most fishermen see it is that, of course, that's a big risk if you have a spill, right? If you have a catastrophic event, that's a huge risk to fisheries. With offshore wind, you're looking at more like all that infrastructure, what you're doing to the ocean bottom over large areas, huge increases in vessel traffic for construction and operations that you don't see in oil and gas. And so they're really not, it's really not a direct comparison.
Right. Well, I thought that was, one of the things that popped in my head when you were talking about this is, and I've written a lot about renewables and land use conflicts, that there's this vacant land myth, right? That, oh, well, there's just a lot of land out there that nobody's using. And it seems to me this is the nautical equivalent, or ocean, the offshore equivalent of the empty ocean myth. Oh, well, there's nothing out there. But in looking at the maps, that when I was in Montauk, at all the subsea structures and wrecks and and cables, and that the oceans are actually pretty crowded, and there aren't that many places where you can just say, oh, well, there's nothing else there. No, I mean, between navigation, fishing, and all these other things that are on the bottom of the ocean that have to be avoided, unexploded ordnance was one of them. I mean, it's a crowded place. And this idea that, is that a fair assessment? I mean, just I'm working from memory on some of these things, but is that fair, that this is a crowded?
That's absolutely right. And you have all the different fisheries, recreational fisheries, and the folks doing leisure, and the shipping industry. Yeah, I mean, these are incredibly busy waters as it is. And it's really easy for us on land to sit here and think, look out there and say, oh, well, it is what it is. But, there's all that activity out there. And that's before you even look at how complex fisheries management is, right? Just because you have a fishing permit, there's also this myth that you can just go out and catch the fish, and fishermen are overfishing everything. And what's the big deal anyway? They can just go somewhere else. And that could not be further from the truth. We have the most highly regulated fisheries in the world here in the US. We have the most sustainable fisheries in the world. And that's because of such strict limitations on things like where you can go to avoid bycatch, or to avoid interacting with whales, or, or these other things, or avoid sensitive habitat or spawning areas. So you can't just move around like that. And that's within an already crowded ocean. So
the fishermen can't just go somewhere else, right?
Can't just go somewhere else.
This is where this, and one of the, in specific, when I think it was the Equinor project, the lease was granted, and it sits atop, if memory serves, some of the most productive scallop and squid fisheries on the eastern seaboard. Is that true?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And especially, that one does. And then we have these new leases proposed in New York Bight that are even worse in a lot of ways in terms of the siting. New York Bight, that's the busiest harbor, on the eastern seaboard, if not, one of the busiest harbors in the world. It's obviously geographically constricted. You have huge fisheries operating there, all different types of vessel traffic, all different kinds of national security concerns. And, we're just squeezing more and more in. And unfortunately, with a lot of these concerns, they become deconflicted. They'll deconflict other uses first, right? So they'll say, well, people don't want to see the turbines because they're big, right? They're 3 times as high as the Statue of Liberty. They're huge.
So that means what, the towers are 600 feet high? I know some of the ones.
Yeah, more over 800. Yeah, and getting bigger every day.
Right.
Yeah, and so.
And when you say deconflicted, I don't know that I've heard that term before, but that was moving them further. Former Governor Cuomo, glad to wave goodbye to him. Little editorial comment here. But he said famously one time that even Superman standing on Montauk Point wouldn't be able to see these turbines, right? Because they were going to be so he's nodding, in fact, to the fact that wealthy beach house owners, vacation homeowners don't want to see these turbines offshore. So is that what you mean by deconflicted? Is that where you're going?
Yes, deconflicted is sort of a term that the federal government and the states use, yes, to talk about sort of minimizing the opposition here.
I see.
As it were. Yeah. And so, if you look at shipping lanes, if you look at those view shed issues, there's all these uses like that they'll take off the table for leasing, right? They have criteria that, we won't lease areas based on this or that for those other uses. Well, for commercial fishing, we don't have anything like that. There's no metric that says, because this area is important to fisheries, we're not going to put turbines there. And so what you really hear in this is the fishermen being the ones that are very loudly saying, well, we're concerned here. We're concerned about the environment. We're concerned about our access. We're concerned about food production. And it seems like the whole public a lot of times is turning around and saying, well, why are those fishermen just being jerks? They must be climate change deniers. They just don't want to be affected at all. And that's really, really unfair. You have a lot of people that don't want to be affected. Nobody wants to be affected by energy production of any kind, to be honest. Everybody would rather not see it or not have it interfere with them. They want to use the power, but they don't want to. And I have not seen any indication of fishermen not being willing to take their share of the burden, right, or their share of the impact here. But instead, it's like you said, we're looking at this like the Wild West, or even like the gold rush. Oh, there's all these lands offshore. Just stick it there. No harm, no foul. And if the fishermen are complaining about it, it's just because they're kind of Neanderthals anyway. right? And that's really, really unfair. And that unfortunately is the messaging that we come across every day.
Well, so let me step back for a minute because I want to dive down into some of the other conflicts and some of the other projects that are already facing litigation. But when I look at the history of offshore wind, and there's been a ton of hype around it. I remember in 2010, former Interior Secretary Ken Salazar said, "Oh, we'll have 20,000 megawatts by 2020," and there are now, I think, 30 megawatts. I mean, there has been a tremendous amount of hype, tremendous amount of media coverage over what the potential has been, or what the potential is. But yet now 10 years or more than a decade after the Interior Secretary said, "Oh, we're going to have all this offshore wind," we have effectively zero. And by the way, the Block Island project, here's a specific question. Isn't that project still offline now because of problems with the power cable?
Correct.
So we built 30 megawatts of wind. There are 5 turbines, 6 megawatts each, and they're not producing anything after even a decade of hype. Even the 30 megawatts we built is not doing anything. Is that right?
Yeah, that's my understanding. I don't have any inside knowledge of the Block Island project, but my understanding is that 2 of the cables became unburied and have to be reburied at huge cost and obviously environmental impact. And they have come offline since, I believe, May due to some problem with the structural integrity of the turbine or the blades or something in there. So they're not operating. And you're right. And this is what makes it's so difficult to address offshore wind in a responsible way, because the messaging is like, we need it all now. We're going to get all this. It's going now. It's going super fast.
Climate change. Right, climate change,
got to do it. And then we also hear, it's real, we haven't even really developed that technology yet. It would be too early to speculate what the technology would look like. And we want to bring those jobs to the US, but we have to unleash the market first. So we have to, and there's this real dichotomy between being told that it's always too early or too late to actually work on these things in earnest. And that leaves, obviously the fishing industry and environmentalists and other folks that are interested in this sort of, much more sound planning. It's almost like that's on purpose to leave them out in the cold, right? Is that we both know and don't know too much to really do anything. And that's really unfortunate. I think that really gets in the way of being able to make progress on this. I mean, look at the West Coast where we have off of California, I think a little over 1,000 square miles that's just about to be leased for floating offshore wind. There is essentially one pilot scale floating offshore wind project operating in the world. We don't, and they'll freely say we don't know what that technology will look like by the time we're ready to develop it. But you have in the Gulf of Maine, off of California, and the Gulf of Mexico, and looking into Oregon and Washington as well, leasing these huge areas for it. Well, why are we leasing so many areas if we don't even know what it is? Can we sit down and talk about what it is?
If we don't have the technology.
Right. And can't fishing industry and other ocean users be involved in the design of that technology so that when it does come to market, when it does come to fruition, if indeed it is a good idea for energy production and for the environment and everything else, it can at least be designed in a way to minimize impacts to fishing and to food production. I mean, the whole thing seems really, really backwards.
Well, so I know that there have been there's litigation now pending against. Well, let me ask this specific question about all this. The hype around wind. So why hasn't it? Is the reason why we haven't seen more wind turbines built in U.S. waters that all of the obstacles around permitting? I mean, why after 10 years hasn't there been more capacity built?
That's a good question. I think the answer would absolutely depend on who you ask. I think there's people that like to blame the fishing industry, right? Political pressure. I don't think that's the case, to be honest. There was, in the last administration, we did see the Vineyard Wind project was delayed for about 1.5 years to do a cumulative effects environmental review that had not been done previously. That's a pretty standard thing to do. I mean, for any major federal project, you have to do a cumulative effects review. And so whether that really slowed it down, I mean, I don't think so. I think that had that not been done up front, it would have had to be done on the back end because it was a real legal risk to the project to move forward without doing that.
But now more recently, you've seen the Nantucket residents, I think, sue over, sued over Vineyard Wind over concern out of the right whale. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Now we're seeing actual species, distinct species concerns coming to the fore in terms of litigation. And that's just one of the claims the other litigation that I'm familiar with is it was another renewable energy company, a solar developer, suing the permitting organization, I've forgotten who it was, saying, oh, well, no, you shouldn't, you haven't done a thorough review on that offshore project. So it seems like, as I look at it, I'm not saying your concerns aren't merited, but there just seems like there's a whole lot more delay that's going to happen to a lot of these projects. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, you would think, and of course, looking back to Cape Wind, which was the first planned
Yes, thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, exactly.
Right. I mean, it didn't go anywhere because of litigation, and so, definitely keeping an eye on that. The interesting thing with the right whales case is that when they leased that area to Vineyard Wind about 9 or 10 years ago now, they looked at where the right whales were and thought, maybe this is an okay area to put offshore wind projects. But since then, ironically, partially due to climate change, but other reasons, the right whales have constricted into that area. And for the last few years, a very significant percent of the remaining right whale population has been feeding in and been congregating in that project area. And of course, the federal government, being as clunky as it is, you can't go back and change the area. But what do you do now, right? So these are incredibly complicated questions. But from the fisheries perspective, there are so many fisheries restrictions driven by the scarcity of right whales, right? And we've all heard about this, the fishing lines and how they get entangled in this and that. We've recently had a ruling on the lobster fishery that they had to reduce their right whale interactions by 98% because of jeopardy to the right whale population. Well, now where most of the right whales are, we're just going to go use the loudest hammers in the world and increase all this vessel traffic when we know that ship strikes is really a huge cause of right whale mortality, right? So of course that doesn't quite sit right with people, and they're saying, well, why, we're getting blamed as fishermen for climate change and not wanting renewable energy and all this stuff, but we are doing our part. And why do these other people just get a carte blanche to do whatever they want with very limited analysis about how that really will impact the right whales? And I think that's a fair question.
You mentioned that. As you said that, I was thinking about, well, who are the companies that are leading the charge here on a lot of this offshore wind? And it's not, from what I see, it's not American companies. These are foreign companies, Equinor, BP. I've forgotten who some of the other ones, the Spaniards, I think. I mean, it's interesting to see how the tax incentives, and in this case, it would be the investment tax credit, not the production tax credit, right? Because they get that investment tax credit right up front. That it's foreign companies that are being very aggressive in their efforts to get into the offshore wind game. Is that a fair statement, or is this mostly foreign companies?
And again, importantly, it's foreign oil and gas companies. I mean, this, to a person, like this is not your neighborhood environmental NGO, putting together a few turbines out of sticks and twigs, right? This is Shell Oil. This is like you said, Equinor. They're mostly European national utility companies that either are still heavily involved in oil and gas or started that way and then divested of their oil and gas portfolios for, like you said, the tax credits and the investment here. And so it's incredible to us looking at these companies and the way they behave. And they came in from day one super slick on the sort of corporate social responsibility and the community engagement and that kind of stuff, as you would expect. But using that oil and gas playbook. And when people come in doing that using the oil and gas playbook, our politicians and our public say, wait a minute here, let's make sure that we have the proper level of oversight. Let's make sure that we're regulating them effectively. And for this one, it's, climate change. So just let them stick it in there. It's the most important thing, let's go faster. And it's been very, very challenging. And it sort of painted my group RODA and the fishermen otherwise as the only ones willing to say anything, to ask these kind of inconvenient questions, if you will. And it's not, it's not anything, it's not a fisherman for coal burning, it's not like that, but it's like, can we look into this a little bit? Can we just treat this like we treat another industry that's going to be taking up this huge amount of public resources, right?
So so that's interesting. So if I paraphrase what you said, you just want to be treated like any other industry, but you want a fair shake. You make sure your voices are heard. Well, it sure appears that they're being heard. And I know I mentioned the litigation, but it was just a few weeks ago, the governor of Maine signed a law and signed legislation into law that prohibits the installation of wind turbines within Maine's state waters. So it seems like the fishermen are already having that. It seems like now how many turbines would be built that close to shore? I don't know, but it seems like that's a win, is it not?
So yes, and that it is a good thing to have that sort of moratorium and that deeper dive before looking at offshore wind in state waters. There's a pretty common thread here when offshore wind decisions are made to say that they were made on behalf of the fishing industry or at the request of the fishing industry. And if you follow the paper trail, that's not always necessarily where the request came from. But not that I think there was anyone in the fishing industry in Maine that was not supportive of that. But of course, the subtext there is that was because the state's moving forward with what it's calling a research array in federal waters. It's actually pretty large if you think about what a research array would be, and was looking for buy-in on that siting process. But, peeling another layer back of the onion, there's competition between Maine, New Hampshire, Massachusetts over the federal waters there. And there's a lot of political maneuvering about kind of who gets there first and how they do it. You can imagine, I don't know this to be true, but it's my best guess that in coastal Maine, given who lives on the coast in Maine, that viewshed issue was probably pretty high up on the list too for a state waters moratorium. We certainly see that in other places too. So I wasn't involved in that decision, but that's my best guess.
It's interesting you bring that up because like onshore, I think there's very much a class issue here about who owns the land that's nearby. I've researched this. I've written about it. The wind industry onshore don't put wind turbines in wealthy counties. The counties in New York in particular, where wind turbines are being built, are among the poorest counties in this state. Same in California, where Shasta County just rejected a wind project. I think it's the 6th or 8th lowest income among all of the states, and California is a wealthy state, is very much toward the lower end of the income spectrum. But I found the data here about, there was an article about it, when you add up Maine, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Maryland, Virginia, all have goals. The total is something like 28 gigawatts of capacity that they're targeting, another 7.5 gigawatts. So that's 36 gigawatts. We're talking about potentially 3,600 offshore platforms. That's nearly twice as many as the number of offshore oil and gas platforms as the Gulf of Mexico. I mean, it seems pretty well a very apt definition of industrialization of the oceans. If you're going to have twice as many platforms for wind as you would for oil and gas, that's the part, I guess, that just boggles my mind, that the usual suspects when it comes to environmental protection are saying, oh, no, that's fine, because this is, low carbon, no carbon, climate change, whatever, that they're willing to forego that environmental protection of the oceans because climate change trumps everything else. Am I missing something, or am I just cynical about all of this?
I don't know. If you are, then I am too, because I think that's exactly right. I mean, if you're looking at really ways to aggressively, as this administration says, address climate change, looking at things like energy efficiency. I mean, there's a lot of ways to do that, right? And it really needs to be like a blended, all of the above strategy. But we've really gone all in on this one thing. And you're right. I mean, as far as energy production goes, this is one of the least land use, or in this case, seabed use effective. It's just not efficient. And so we really are, we absolutely believe that we're looking at biodiversity trade-offs, at ecosystem and habitat trade-offs, at migration corridors, all this kind of stuff that you wouldn't necessarily be looking at with other ocean strategies. And as you brought up, that other half of this is super important, is this kind of, this environmental justice as we look at it. We have all of the prominent community organizations coming out and talking about the disparate impacts to low-income communities of climate change, right? Things like asthma, right. Things like air pollution.
Right.
And that's super important. But we also don't have anywhere any number that shows how these offshore wind projects, even this 36 gigawatts or, the number you cited, what is that actually going to do to reduce air pollution, much less climate change in those communities? I've never seen that analysis. We've certainly asked for it. Nobody's ever been able to produce that about what the actual difference is going to be. Whereas we do know that it's going to affect fishing jobs, and we do know that the jobs created by offshore wind are not going to be these jobs that sort of maintain and perpetuate the heritage of these communities that we have, that are really, really dependent on fishing and have been for hundreds of years, if not longer, if we're talking about traditional and native communities.
It's interesting you say that, because what popped in my head was when I was in Montauk now 4 years ago and meeting some of the Bonnickers, and some men who had been fishing in their family for 15 or 16 generations. And it's remarkable given, Montauk's very Tony now, very expensive, and yet they've stuck it out for that long. I mean, it's truly remarkable. They can track their history back in fishing back centuries on that island. And that to a person, they were saying, no, we don't want this. This does nothing for us. And in particular, they were concerned not just about the turbines offshore, because for many of them, because they're inland fishermen, they're fishing in shallow water, that doesn't mean anything to them, but the transmission lines were a problem. And this seems to be the other, in addition to the footprint of the massive thousands of square miles, potentially footprint of the turbines themselves, it always seems the problem, where do you put it, right? And I was just talking to a utility guy this morning. He called himself a dumb utility guy. He said it's always about transmission, technology, and time. And he put transmission first. So it seems, well, I'll ask the question this way. Where are you already seeing conflicts over the landing of the transmission lines besides what we just mentioned on Block Island?
Yeah, always, everywhere you have them. You've had conflicts to the point where in states like New York and New Jersey, and now I believe there's one in California, they're proposing and passing legislation to actually take away that's sort of home rule, as we call, right? Those sort of local oversight and that local decision-making authority to talk about what's actually happening in their communities. And that is a very, very concerted lobbying effort. That's a very planned, well-funded thing that's happening there, because they know that as soon as you start to look at this local scale of impacts, that people are going to start to ask those questions and have a lot of concerns. There are only so many places in US that offshore wind energy transmission can plug in. And we know this, but they won't disclose in advance where those are, right? And I'm not an energy expert, I'm a fish expert, right? I don't know where things can plug in. But they would never tell the fishermen that and say, okay, well, realistically, we're looking at this area because it's going to have to route around here and plug in there. They say, oh no, the whole thing's wide open. Just tell us what you think, right? This is what I was saying about these, a lot of engagement opportunities, but very little authentic engagement where you're not really getting that information.
So and is it because if they don't want to put their cards on the table because they know then that gives more time for opposition to coalesce or in opposition to the side of the transmission line? Is that your suspicion?
I mean, it sure looks like that, right? If we can't get basic information, everything's deemed confidential. But why, when they're out doing surveys and learning about the habitat and this, why is that confidential? Why can't we, if this really is for the good of the public, and this is really something where we're trying to get better energy production and address climate change, why can't we get some of that information to inform fisheries management if they're out there with cameras getting information about the habitat, right? That's just one example, but every single thing is confidential, including when they apply for their contracts, their proposed fisheries mitigation plans. And I'm not talking about money. I'm talking about how they're going to work with fishermen. That comes out redacted for years until they sort of finesse it with the state or with the federal government. And then we'll finally disclose how they want to talk to fishermen. It doesn't make any sense at all. It's not, there's nothing about this where you think it's this sort of collaborative, come in, okay, everybody's a good environmentalist here. It doesn't work that way. This is dealing with big companies, and they behave like you would expect big companies to behave.
So are fishermen just getting big-footed here?
I mean, I think that's right. I think, what we've seen in the UK is that there are, in the UK and in Europe, there are some members of the fishing industry that have benefited from offshore wind, right? Like there are always a handful of people that are going to get research contracts, that are going to get service vessel contracts and be able to work with the developers, or get the guy that sells ice, right, off of his dock for fishing trips. Maybe he can sell ice to the developers and get a nice contract for that. The problem is that those are really few and far between. Like there's definitely going to be winners and losers, and it's going to concentrate what's already a highly consolidating industry in fisheries, like you said, talking about the Bonackers. And so, we know that it's creating a bigger rift between the have and have-nots. And what you get is the European developers coming over here, parading around saying, oh, but fishermen in Europe love this. Fishermen in Europe, if you actually talk to them, they, for the most part, they have nothing but concerns and problems. The cable lines being a big one of them. And that's what they've said to us is, everybody in US right now is speculating too much about the turbines. It's that huge network of cables that's just going through the whole ocean that's really going to cause problems for fishing and for the environment.
How much money's at stake?
I mean, it's confidential, right? But I've heard estimates that each of these projects is worth in the $3 plus billion-dollar range. We've tried to look into the math a little bit on the subsidies and sort of, and the rate price and all that kind of stuff. You can't get that information.
So if I can interrupt, so if the project is priced at $3 billion and the ITC, if memory serves, is 30%, so the tax credits alone for these projects would be 30% of the total cost, roughly, almost a third. So we're talking about $1 billion or more in tax credits if they can get these projects built.
Right, and then there's the back end of the actual power purchase price and all of the things and all of that, and the special deals and the OREX, right, the credits that go with all of that. And so there's a lot to it. And again, I don't claim to be an expert on any of the financials of these things, but I also, again, looking at it when you see the oil and gas companies and when you see the owners of a lot of these projects being the big investment groups. I mean, Vineyard Wind, this first project, the original owner was Blackstone Group, right, an affiliate of Blackstone. These are the international finance companies owning these projects. This isn't, again, this isn't someone's backyard putting up a little pinwheel.
Well, I like that. Well, the original owner,
that commercial, there's that car commercial with people blowing on the pinwheel, and I'm like, that's not what we're talking about.
That's not what we're talking about. Well, it's interesting you say that about these are big investment houses that are doing that, because that was the company that started Block Island, right? That was the D.W. Shaw, right? It wasn't even an energy company. It was a VC or a private equity firm.
That's right. That's how that one started, and that was one of the few. That was a U.S. private equity firm, and now what we're seeing is more of the international ones, like Vineyard Wind. So it's Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners, which is an equity firm. Right. It's all of these, and if you look at any of the firms, they're all pretty heavily invested in these things. And what we know is it starts with the investment firms, then you get these developers, these oil and gas companies that don't really have any specific expertise in the offshore wind. They subcontract all of the technical stuff. And then in Europe, certainly, we see as soon as they're built, they sell them off to foreign companies. And right now, who's big in the offshore wind market's China, right? And so in Europe, they're selling a lot of the built projects off to Chinese firms, which is obviously a concern.
Right. Well, so what are the next steps? What are the things you're working on now that are the immediate concerns? Because you have a lot of projects that are being proposed. At least some of the leases have already been made. What's top of mind for you as and I'll interrupt here just a second. I'm talking with Annie Hawkins. She's the executive director of the Responsible Offshore Development Alliance. It's a coalition of fishing industry groups. You can learn more about them at RODA fisheries.org. That's RODA fisheries.org. So what's top of mind for you? What's on your to-do list for the next week, month, year?
Oof. Maybe sleep someday with all this coming with it. Rest is few and far between. But we have come up with a list of sort of goals for collaboration. I mean, really our key task here is to get fishermen involved as co-planners, right? And get better, more transparent information about what's going on. So we have, within RODA, we essentially have two portfolios, if you will. One is policy communications, information sharing, and then we also have a research program within RODA, where we have, an in-house PhD fishery scientist. We've got grants with the federal government and some states where we're looking to get better information, even starting with like literature reviews of what's out there, which is surprisingly not that much, and then start to get more specific impact studies and improve.
And in terms of literature review, you're talking about the data on where whales are congregating, where you have the most abundant fish. I mean, what literature review and what regard?
I mean, at this point, it's fairly limited to what we've seen in Europe, right?
So the impacts that you can observe of the development on fisheries. Is that what you're talking about?
Exactly. Yeah, and and it's interesting because people talk a lot about offshore wind research, and there's a lot going on, and the developers fund so much. They're funding monitoring studies, and so they're going out there and just sort of looking at what's happening, right? Monitoring doesn't really get you anything for understanding what impacts are. It doesn't really get you, you can't, with the scientific method, you have to make a hypothesis and then test it, right? and collect your data in a format that's going to test that hypothesis. So just going and counting fish, here and there is not really answering any scientific questions, especially when those plans aren't coordinated between projects. And so that's kind of the extent to what, like, that's where we're at right now with offshore wind science is we're just, each developer will just go out there and catch fish. Well, we have a lot more questions, like how are fish going to be impacted and what are the factors that are going to impact them? Is it, electromagnetic fields coming off the cables? Is it heat? Is it changes in ocean currents and larval distribution? And so there's a lot of that we're really trying to do a deeper dive into.
And I'm sorry, but isn't one of those issues really the noise issue? Because I mean, this has been a recurring problem, and the industry, the wind industry, give them credit. They've been able to bury this issue, and very few media outlets have reported on it. I've done a lot of reporting on it, but on the deleterious health effects caused by onshore wind turbines to humans. But it seems already there are some indications that offshore wind turbines are producing noise that may be problematic for marine mammals. Is that true?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's
and where
the
is
noise
that?
and
Where
the
I'm
vibration.
just a vague memory of that. Where was that occurring? Do you remember? Was that in England or somewhere else?
So we've heard a lot of reports from the Netherlands about dolphin stranding and impacts to dolphins from the noise and from the turbines. I'm not sure that I've seen like a peer-reviewed study that necessarily points back to that, but the fishermen anecdotally are absolutely seeing that out in the areas where there's been offshore wind construction. It's the noise, it's the pile driving, right? The hammers, it's the vibrations, all of these things. And like you said, there is certainly plenty of evidence that happens on land. So what's going to happen when that's actually in the water column? It's a great question. I mean, also light, right? There's a lot of light associated with the turbines and the substations. We have fish that, go to the top of the water column twice a day to feed. Is that going to throw them off? Is that, there's things like that are very specific to the location, to the fisheries, to the environment, that we can start to look at in labs or in studies, or maybe if there's equivalents in Europe, but in a lot of cases there's not, and you can only predict and do before and after. But the way we're planning it right now, where we're going from 0 turbines to 3,000 turbines over the course of 3 years, is not a really great approach for doing before and after studies, right? Because we don't have time to get baseline data, we don't have time to get data after, and then adjust course and utilize adaptive management when we do start to see those environmental impacts come true. So we're really, really focused for sure on the science, as well as, sort of other types of science, research that you don't think about as much, like radar interference. What's going to happen to marine radar systems? We certainly know that turbines interfere with radar. That is a very, very well-known fact for every kind of radar. What's that going to do to fishing vessels and their ability to get home safely, right? That all of that kind of stuff is stuff that we're really focused on trying to get answers to.
But that's also an issue for the Department of Defense, for civilian aviation, for other industries that rely on offshore, that need radar. And there was in fact, I remember Bonnie Brady gave me a document from 2014, I think, from one federal regulator expressing very much concern about the issue of radar, which could be a real, if you have radar interference, particularly during a winter storm, maybe there's an oil spill, a tanker goes down, something that, I mean, this could be big blind spots in the ocean if you have these hundreds or even thousands of turbines. Is that the case?
That's the case. And we've had, we've heard from fishermen over in Europe that fish in the turbines, as well as here. We've had some of our fishermen go over there, and they've absolutely been out on vessels in these things and seen the radar just not working. We've seen it happen at Block Island, right, where it throws false targets or shadows or, all sorts of things it can do. And like you said, it's very well documented for, flight radar, DOD radar, all of these things. And strangely, up until very recently, all we've ever heard is, well, we just don't really think it impacts marine radar. And if it does, fishermen can drink more coffee or kind of, adjust where their radar is on the boat. I mean, truly, it's like, you can't make this up, but this is, people have said this in meetings with regulators there, which is offensive. And frankly, it's very in line with a lot of condescending behavior that, when people talk to fishermen in the fishing industry, from the offshore wind industry and from the regulatory authorities, that happens a lot, right? Or it's just, you just stop, you're just complaining, Well,
let me follow up on that, because there was, the news reports that I've seen, in particular about offshore wind in California, that the Navy, the other arms of the DOD, the Department of Defense, have said, oh no, we don't want any wind turbines in this area, right, because of danger to to aviation and for surface water navigation, that they were very concerned about having turbines. And yet it was it the last few days that there was, it was last month, the Schwarzenegger Institute, the Arnold Schwarzenegger Institute at USC released a report funded by the U.S. Clean Power Association, used to be the American Wind Energy Association, claiming 10 gigawatts of offshore wind in California would, quote, generate resource cost savings of at least $1 billion annually, with 100 to 200,000 job years of employment over the next 2 decades. And then they projected pollution levels out to 2040. I thought, well, this is bold. You're going to tell me what this is going to look like in 20 years? I mean, truly remarkable. But there just seems to be an enormous amount of money pushing these projects, and that the amount of opposition coming and the exposure of the opposition, like your group, has been very little. I mean, that's my impression as a journalist. I suppose you're going to be inclined to agree with me here.
No, you're right. And honestly, that's fair. I mean, we're a 3-year-old organization. We have 3 staffers. We're 3 people working on this full time, right? And we've got a lot of members, but we don't have oil money, right? Like, although we get accused of it all the time, which is adorable, because there's just so much game playing going on here. But no, you're absolutely right. And the wind trade associations and the clean energy trade associations put out, I mean, they just have infinite money and messaging to put this information out, and it is really, really, really hard to fact check. The one you just referenced, in fact, recently put out a 2-pager that 10 myths about offshore wind and commercial fishing, and then proceeded to put forward myths that supposedly, I guess, fishermen were claiming, and then debunk the myths. And it was one of the most bizarre things I've ever seen. I mean, the thought of putting words in someone's mouth like that and saying, oh no, everything's fine, and we're going to get in front of what the fishermen are going to say and tell you that it's fine, when you're really talking about, in most cases, struggling communities, low income communities, people that are not well politically connected, being the fishing industry in this case. And you're also talking about a resource, a food production sector during COVID, who is absolutely struggling to make ends meet and keep going out as essential employees. And this is the kind of treatment they get. I mean, it's incredibly offensive. And I've never seen, in years and years and years of my career, I've never seen anyone sort of behaving that way. And I think it's really irresponsible.
You're talking about the U.S. Clean Power Association here, the 10 myths? Okay.
Yeah. And stuff like that. And I mean, and that's what happens. And so there's just so much misinformation about what the fishermen are saying or what these other groups are saying, because we don't have the platforms that they have. We don't have multi-million-dollar lobbyists and lawyers and greased elbow people. And so they really are in charge of the messaging. And it is the most frustrating thing here, because it's like, who are you going to believe? The 16th generation fishermen, or the multinational oil and gas company here? But it's like they've managed to twist it around so much that you can't even get to the facts of a situation. And so, we always talk about transparency and getting better information out there. What does that really mean? It's really hard to accomplish in practice.
Right. So, you have the one experience with Block Island, and that's really the only turbines that now are in U.S. waters. If you're going to handicap it, which one of these projects is furthest along in the permitting process, or can you assess that?
Well, there's technically 2 turbines off of Virginia as well, right? The coastal Virginia pilot project are the only 2 in federal waters, but those were just put in, I think, last summer. So, Vineyard Wind looks to be first, right? They've received the final approval from the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. They're the only one that's gotten sort of that far and gotten through that final step and gotten the record of decision. The South Fork project off of Long Island is getting really close. They've just finished the environmental review for that. And so I think that decision is imminent. It's really unclear to me when construction actually begins, because the timelines for these change every time you ask. And so I would think that Vineyard Wind would be, I would assume that they're assuming that they're first in line for construction, but how things actually come together, it just seems like, every day it's another curveball, another something. And so it's hard for me to know.
Right. Well, so what are the strongest arguments? This is one of the things that we've been we've talked about a lot of things, and that the fishermen are the underdogs. They're they don't get they don't get the kind of respect in the process. But if you were appearing, I'm putting you on the spot here again, but if you were appearing before a permitting organization and you said, well, these are the three biggest problems, what are they?
Yeah, in terms of the biggest I guess the biggest problems in terms of the actual impacts are probably a little different than the biggest, political, sort of like sound bites, right?
Right.
But yeah, I mean, I think, my sort of big argument when I talk to people a lot, I'm from Massachusetts. I talk to people all the time that are like, Annie, what's wrong with you? You used to be an environmentalist. Now you're like trying to shut down clean energy, right? And I say, that's not true. But the, I think it's that energy is energy. The energy industry is the energy industry, and it should be regulated, right? And we should just really need to make sure we're crossing our T's and dotting our I's and actually overseeing these projects and what's going on with them in the same way we do for any other kind of industry. We've seen them.
I like that because it seems when I hear you say that, you're saying, well, there's this halo around this one form of energy, and therefore they seem to be getting a more lenient treatment from federal regulators or even state regulators. Is that fair assessment of the halo idea?
Yeah, and I can give you a good example of that. So we know that icing is a huge problem offshore, particularly in New England, right? And we know it because the fishing boats get totally iced over. I can show you pictures
icing on the turbine, right? Icing on the turbine blades, to be clear.
Right, here. And so the turbine blades, right? They accumulate ice, especially if they're turned off, and then they start up again, or the sun comes out and it starts to break up the ice, and it can go flying, right? This has happened in Europe. People have seen it. It happens on onshore turbines, happens on vessels. That is pretty concerning if you're on a boat out there anywhere near a turbine and there's these, giant multi-ton ice hunks, just sort of flinging, right? Something people are concerned about. Totally fair question to ask. Is this something that the developers have thought about? Is this something that BOEM has thought about? Is this something that there's going to be de-icing procedures required? And, we've been asking this question for years, and everyone's, well, there's de-icing technology, but it's proprietary, and don't worry. Stop. You're being weird. Don't worry about that. And, and our members keep bringing it back to me, well, but we are worried about that. And I say, well, that seems reasonable to me, right? So we finally got a response from the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management on this, because it's something we've been raising in comment letters for years. And the response was, it's close to an exact quote, it's the basic responsibility of a prudent operator to ensure that their turbines don't ice over and throw ice. So we're not concerned about that. So well, since when have we ever looked at any large industry and said, well, the basic responsibility of a prudent operator, that they won't do that.
Yeah.
That's not how we regulate anything. It's not even common sense, right?
We're going to trust them. Yeah.
Right. And so it's, and we're sitting here saying, well, we're going from 0 to 3,000. Of course, there's things that we can't predict, but if there's things that we really reasonably can predict, why are we not doing that? Especially if this complaint, as you said, is that why is it taken 10 years going from what Salazar originally said in 2010. If we've had all this time, why aren't we using that to try to get a little smarter? Instead, we're talking about it like we're not progressing. We're also saying that we don't have time to work out these issues. And it's very, very convoluted.
So just a couple more things then. And my guest again is Annie Hawkins. She's the executive director of the Responsible Offshore Development Alliance. It's a group of commercial fishermen, fishing associations, fishing companies committed to improving the compatibility of new offshore development with their businesses. You can learn more about them at rodafisheries.org. That's RODA fisheries.org. So we've covered a lot of ground, a lot of water, I suppose, in this case. And it does look like the fishermen are being back-footed here. So I ask all my guests, well, what are you reading? I mean, I know you're working very hard at your job, but what's on your nightstand, or what's in your library? What are the books that are on your shelf these days and that you're paying attention to? I didn't say reading. If you're not reading, you don't have to make any excuses. You don't blush here. It's okay.
This is not an excuse. It's a sad fact about my I would say my personal life. It's not my personal life, but these documents. So we have been so flooded in these environmental review documents this summer about these projects because the government is not looking at these cumulatively, right? It's not saying, okay, this is our offshore wind leasing program. It's project by project. And they put out these thousands of page documents and say, you have 30 days to tell us everything we need to know and give your public input. And there's several of these a week that are due. Well, it's also high fishing season right now for most fisheries, right? So our members are out there doing what they do. And a lot of it falls on us to make sure that we're keeping an eye on that and looking at these records and commenting. And there's just so many pages that are actually look like a deliberate attempt, in my opinion. I'll come out and say it, to actually prevent meaningful public engagement. And so by the time I, log off at the end of the night, I can't even see straight. I mean, it's just an incredible amount of literature and materials dealing with this.
So that's okay. That's okay. I'm not going to beat you up. But so what you're reading is a lot of environmental impact statements and a lot of federal reports.
Yes, and it's incredibly dry.
Okay, no problem. So last question for you, Annie Hawkins. What gives you, you've made clear your challenges. What gives you hope?
Oh boy. So I will say that the one thing that we have seen happen through this is really to see the fishing communities coming together in a way that they never have before. I know that sounds really hokey, but it's true. I think between COVID and all of this and just the overall challenges with fishing and in the fleet, we've seen people working incredibly well together. We've seen people really sort of rising to the occasion here, giving their time and their attention to do everything they can to try to improve this. But also just sort of overall seeing the resilience and adaptability of the fishermen and of the fishing communities. I mean, they really are amazing at going with the flow, meeting these challenges. And this is a big one. I mean, if you go to any, any hearing or anything involving like seafood industry right now, they'll say like the number one threat is offshore wind, or it's at least, top three to their future and their livelihood. But I do think at the end of the day, they're incredibly resilient and adaptable people, and we're going to do the best we can to figure this out somehow. But we also need to first take a really hard look and consider if this is the right thing, if this is really, if it's too much, what are the benefits of this technology at all? Are we getting what we want to get out of it? And is the risk to the environment and to our coastal communities too much?
Well, that's a good response. Annie Hawkins, thanks for your time today, being on the Power Hungry podcast. As I said, you can find out more about Annie and the Responsible Offshore Development Alliance at rodafisheries.org. So Annie, thanks again for being on the Power Hungry podcast. Thanks to all of you in podcast land. Tune in for the next episode. It's going to be maybe as good as this one. And if it's not, I hope you're not disappointed. Until next time, thanks.
Thank you.